any difficulty type thing. So, okay, all right.
Yeah,
Now,
go
I
ahead.
think I, I'm trying to be more organized. And so just a summary wise, we talked about primarily after saying how I became Asian, we talked about, the focused on the us versus them last time. And we talked about the human evolution as to how, the initially there was some not enough data about out of Africa origin of humanity. And the point that we emphasized was like there were only 1,200 people who made it across the Arabian, that entered the Arabian Peninsula from continental Africa. So that was, we almost didn't make it. So those were the points that we made. And we discussed how the prejudice is hardwired, so to speak. And we just introduced as to how, even the classical Greek philosophy wise, the us versus them was basically people who were different. And it wasn't quite just based on race. And roots of slavery are a lot longer and go back to a lot before, the uh, coming to the new world and the slave trade, as we know very well. So those are the things that we talked about, type thing. So, and this is, I don't think I showed this slide, I showed it in the other class, so I'm getting a bit mixed up, but just to refresh, this was one of the Venetian slave traders. So he was like the first one that he captured a bunch of people and uh, and gave them as a gift to the king of Portugal. So he takes the credit or the blame. And I think I looked up the 1619 project type thing, and it's a lot of thing as to when the first slave trade was started type thing. So that is part of the thing. So I think, but it that gets into a lot of political thing, and this is by no means, I'm not a historian or politician, so I won't get into too much this thing. But it was, you know, uh, turned as a scholarly project by a lot of African American, academics type of thing, and that in the New York Magazine, and then turned into this thing. So now, obviously, initially the people from continents, had few intrepid travelers had gone across to the other parts of the world, like I'll be just starting with Marco Polo and Ibn Battuta, that he was uh, from the Maghreb and Tunisia, I think, and he had traveled all across. And there were some other people named Francois Bernier who had traveled to India, before Vasco da Gama, and a Russian guy who had traveled to India. So those description had filtered back into Middle Europe, post Renaissance and uh, before Enlightenment. So their knowledge was secondhand type of thing, and with like every gossip, it magnified as to how, starting from Herodotus' history as to how there were trees that grew gold, so it's just so their evidence was pretty much based on what the interpretation was. And obviously, but the Greeks had the origin of the word Ethiopia as to they were black, and the original theory of the uh, physical appearance or physiognomy or phenotype, the more genetically correct term, was based on climate. So one can say, that they were not too far away from the truth, because when I have a slew of slides, on skin color, the real science behind it, that so they were, probably rightly or wrongly, they were on the correct path. Now, with the uh, European, you know, settlement in South America and Central America, the Spaniards, wanted people to work in the silver mines and agriculture, and later on in the sugar. So they started recruiting the Native Americans, and obviously there was a big this thing that they were so different looking that the big argument based on the theologists and some of the thinkers was, are they really human? So I mean, we can employ them. They're probably not human. They are, going back to the biblical Adamite. There was a whole uh, chain of thought that these are pre-Adamite so to speak, that they are totally different. So we can treat them, they're more close to animals. And, obviously they were not identified as a missing link, but, some were close to that. So they were not exactly the people of the book, so to speak, So that was, but a bishop, a clergyman named Bartholomew de las Casas, he went to the Spanish colonies, or Spanish America, and he saw how they were being worked to death and abused, So it finally he realized that this is not right or not in line with the Christian philosophy. So he finally wrote a book and petitioned King Charles of Spain, and then some along the line, and there were some debates between him and another clergyman named Sepulveda, and they, and obviously finally Bartholomew's, you know, uh, views prevailed, and it was decided that yes, that the Native Americans or Indians, as they were called in those days, were human after all, so they should not be enslaved. But so then they needed substitutes. So that again, so and obviously they had, the Portuguese had discovered, capturing slaves. And I don't know if I mentioned that or not, but there was a huge collaboration from the Native African rulers type of thing, that they were, uh, you know, helped the, just like any other colonized people have helped the outsiders, to uh, conquer. So some of the kings in the other smaller African nations on the West African coast, were helping the Portuguese capture other tribes, the tribal warfare, and in trading for helping defend against the enemy, so to speak, or trading for guns or even whiskey, so to speak. So that was, so they had a lot of, help, so it wasn't just a one-sided black and white issue type thing. So, okay. Now, okay, let's see if I can. Okay. Can you see the slide now?
Yes, we've got Philippus.
Oh, yes, yeah, that's okay. So it moved, yeah. It just, there's a little lag, So when I clicked and on my side, it was a complete blank. So it did, catch up. Okay, so this is a phenomenal name, and those of you who might have taken my class on history of medicine may remember that this was, he's considered the father of toxicology, So he said, because obviously medicine was very primitive, and obviously we were not, the doctors were using arsenic and gold, and, and more people got sick. And so he just said, okay, any medicine in small dose can be beneficial, large dose can be toxic. So he's considered the father of toxicology. And he was, and obviously he was, controversial enough that he had to live one country. I think I'm sure that end up in Switzerland type of thing. Now, as on the forefront as he was of Renaissance, he was still not about thinking in terms of polygenic origin, that human races were totally different and Europeans were at the top. So one could say that on one hand, a more enlightened person could have a totally different thinking type thing. So this was, like it's a pretty, the state is very obvious that the superior heritage, and obviously, so they were considered, that the Europeans were at the top. Okay, and this was a blank slide, so I think I'll just move on to. Okay, and religion and race. Okay, you can see the slide that obviously, no, this is not advanced. Oh yeah, it finally came. It is a lag, so it is catching up type thing. So, and again, obviously they wanted to get the blessing for the slave trade. So, and obviously the Catholic, both Catholic nations authority went all the way to the Pope, and various popes, not just the Pope that's you name who you see in the slide, gave permission that yes, it was reasonable to continue with slave trade type thing. So, and at the same time, there were other people, there were some historians as well who had traveled through, and Africa, West Africa, and had looked at the Africans, and just based on the physical appearance alone, they were sort of, uh, shocked as to see how different they were looked, and some of the African practices they were said. So obviously, the conclusion was, okay, these people are not human. So it is, it's fair game to, capture them. And even, uh, you know, Maghreb Moor, the guy was from Morocco or Tunisia. He was name was Hassan, and he had converted to Christianity, and he was called Leo Africanus, and he had written another story about also the conquest of Guinea, and he had described just yet these people. Obviously, the converted are more religious than perhaps those who are born into it, and he was saying yes that these people were had a beastly lifestyle. They just crave sex and violence, and they're degenerate. So again, his writing became more popular than one would realize type thing. So okay. I think this is goofy. My slide should advance, but I'm getting blank. So
Yeah, we're seeing, okay, we're back on 33 is what we're seeing.
yeah,
We
I see
saw
that.
34 and it was blank.
Yeah, I see that. How it should, should advance. I think so. Yeah, this. Okay, let me stop share. Okay, and see how. Okay, I'm going to stop, and I'm going to restart the PowerPoint once again, see how that goes, so. Yeah, let me load it up completely, and then I'll get to it, I think so. Okay, we should be in business now. Can you see it now?
Slide 38 starts 80,
Yeah,
1493.
okay,
The
got it.
Pope.
So this is, so, okay, so now we're in business. So I think I had a blank slide. That was, I almost had a panic, because I think this was the older version that I had. So there was a couple of blank slides. So we're good. All right. So this was, things. So a lot of popes were, obviously, the religious authority were, like they were given rights as, okay, it is fair game to colonize these people. I think so. Okay. And And again, so the Portuguese slave trade was, in full swing by that time. Let me move that further. And here, this is, the 1619 project, that it's a more recent, this thing. I'm not going to get into it type thing. So, and this, I alluded this to a little bit about Euro whiteness, that Europe is still struggling with, but whether it should stay white or should turn brown like America is turning, like it or not type of thing. So, and this was interesting that according to this book, even the Germans have settled on this particular slogan, which you can read for yourself. I'm not going to try to miss. Together, making Europe stronger type thing. So that has been, so they are going to be president of the European Council of the European Union. So that is this thing. So that started off in July. So this is, so they're still struggling with the big issue of what does it mean to be part of the nation state versus not. Okay, now getting back into the science of uh, classification and race, and most of you remember him from biology class 101 type of thing as to the, he was a botanist by trade, Carl Linnaeus, Swedish botanist. And obviously, he had taken one trip outside of his native Sweden and was to Lapland. And he was so miserable in the cold and other stuff, so he decided never again. Okay, so he decided to, listen to people who had traveled, and based on that, his initial thrust was to classify the natural world. But he was a natural philosopher, as they were called in those days, it, and and obviously starting with botany. And for whatever reason, some of you may know that he identified a lot of things as sex in plants, which was frowned, which was kind of raised a few eyebrows. And his descriptions of plant hybridization were pretty racy, or for that time, like you know uh, uh, the flower seed, the male gamete goes into their marriage bed and has a union. So some of the writings were really hard for other people, to more religious people or more prudish people, to palate. But so then after that, he classified the animal kingdom, and the classification that we studied is coming up in the next slide type thing. So, and but he also, and his book was very popular. The first writing, you know, was by the second and third edition, he had ventured into classifying human beings. And you can see that you can either laugh or frown or whatever as to how it classified Homo sapiens into varieties of races, Homo sapien European, American, Asiatic, Africanus. And just for good measures, because of deformities, because the embryology was not well known, so it classified, as Homo sapiens is monstrous. The ones who were dead went with either cleft palate or, uh, hydrocephalus or what have you type of thing. So this was his bust. I took a picture somewhere in a garden during my trip to Vancouver, Canada. And most recently, the central one is a book written by, it was originally published in Swedish and translated, and this was the title type thing. So it's a little bit of apologistic for his views on racism, and tries to make sense, said he was a product of his time. And so this is, he's like a 400, 500 page biography of Carl Linnaeus, so you can just see that some of these classifications, and obviously he was influenced by other people who had traveled. And this is for Biology 101, this is the classification that all of you had to memorize, at some point, in your grade, starting from kingdom to phylum, class. And there's a mnemonic for that, and I had included that, but I've forgotten how to try to memorize it type thing. So, okay, but this is, so Homo sapiens sapiens, so sapiens, the wise one, type thing. So, and obviously we alluded to, based on and we've got, in terms of just appearance alone, we have, with the molecular biology, we've gone a lot more further, and we've repeated this several times as to how identical we are, because of the limited number of people who managed to populate the world. And the majority of the diversity is, but again, as we pointed out earlier in the example of sickle cell, that the evolution squeezes out the smallest advantage, and that's how the deleterious gene got, did not get eliminated by natural selection, okay. And I'm sure in the other classes I've quoted, and that nothing in biology makes sense except in view of evolution. That was by a Russian evolutionary biologist, Dobzhinsky, and that, that sentence is, and that's why otherwise, and by the time a bad gene does not get eliminated, that's why the diseases such as like Huntington disease, because by the time the disease manifests, people have already had children type thing. So, and again, the so-called variants or polymorphisms are not just confined to Africa and the tropics or the older human population, but there are like some of the genes, like such as for cystic fibrosis, is quite common in the North European population, and as many as 25% of people may have a recessive copy of it. Still, why they don't all get cystic fibrosis, that's a matter of conjecture. But so there are genes, and similarly, I may have briefly alluded to how genes for multiple sclerosis, we may have some of these genes that are still a leftover remnant from Neanderthal may be playing some role. So varieties of, and our immune responses, diabetes, so those genes are not just due to the early Homo sapiens from 90,000 years ago, but from the other species that we inbred with, And obviously, I will have several examples of when you get to the medical portion of it, either not this week, but probably in the last week. Okay, and now this is, and now obviously along with the physical appearance, and that we rely on is speech, the evolution of speech and language is very, very important. And one of the reasons, like if you look at embryology, vocalization or speech was so important that, that they we take the risk of choking, basically. So if you look at the embryology evolution of human, so because, how the evolution has occurred, type thing, that larynx and migration has occurred. So the speech is very important, and that is the big characteristic. And until recently, people were not even believing that Neanderthal had any type of a language type of thing. But so the thinking on that is changing, so to speak. So, and obviously, because in terms of sign language and speech, the chimp, and that's where we are dramatically different in terms of language. And I'm sure, again, I don't want to get into, this is not a genetics class, but some of the genes, like there was in one of the other classes I'd mentioned about how the uh, uh, some Turkish families who had recessive abnormalities, their speech was, and even just the bipedalism was, you know, restricted. So a lot of genes have, even a single gene has a dramatic effect on the development of speech, I think so. So the speech, and now interesting story that I may have talked about it in the history of India class, that when East India Company settled in Calcutta, in order to deal with the natives, a true polymath named William Jones, who was appointed a judge of Supreme Court of Calcutta before in the early days, so I should say probably 1780 or something, and in order to govern the natives, so to speak, he started learning Persian as well as Sanskrit from Hindu and Islamic teachers. And that's when, he realized the similarities that were there between, you can see from the chart between Sanskrit on the left-hand side, Latin, Greek, modern English, and Hindi. So these are just a few examples of some like Pita and Pater, Bruta, Frater, okay, and the similarities. And so you can see the similarities are quite apparent. And even this gets down to the other European languages, such as Latvian, that has a remarkably similarities with some of the words have not been altered at all. So as to why that happened, so that just shows the combined linguistic origin of race. So, and again, so that just create the idea of the Indo-European languages and the combined origin of people. So again, because philology was very big in those days, so that's how it came about. Okay, now I think let's see. Okay, I think I have to move this down to. Okay, and so the two theories that went about amongst the scholars and the natural philosophers of that time were as to whether human origin was monogenism or polygenism. So this is before Darwin. People were already, the paleontologists and various other naturalists or natural philosophers were trying to come to grip with the idea as to, including some, names that have been lost to history type thing. So starting, as you can see how this was almost 200 years before, a guy named La Perrière in France, then other, Locke had some thoughts to say he was monogenic. He believed in the uniform origin of human beings at the same time, and then obviously in the 18th century, Linnaeus had different views. Hume had different views. So it was, really, they were not sure as to which direction they ought to live. So this was, so the controversy continued for several years, and obviously their thinking was heavily influenced by the Bible at that time, because obviously it was the religion had a big influence at that time. So, okay, moving on to the armchair philosopher, the two giants of Western philosophy, that is David Hume on the British side and Immanuel Kant on and the Middle Europe class, who have had a larger than life influence on Western thinking, on Western philosophy, and which continued and obviously, it permeated, to, the founding fathers of America as well. So you can just see how their thinking was, it would make you cringe for the present day, so to speak, that there was never, here is Hume quoted, and there are enough references. And this is an article from the liberal Slate magazine online. There never was a civilized nation of any other complex than white type thing. So, and so this is, so the case is, so, and Immanuel Kant had written several big essays and tomes. And again, just similar to Linnaeus, he had never bothered traveling across, further than, Middle Europe, or there was no Germany for then those days, so to speak. So, okay. So this were, and on the other side, there were a lot of other paleontologists who had a different thing. So this is just laying a ground for pre-Darwin as to, this is Comte de Buffon, okay? And he was a lot more liberal and monogenic, and thinking that, yes, all the human beings are, and he was polymath to it's to an amazing extent when you look at his biography. He was a naturalist, mathematician, cosmologist, and he had written a 16-volume history of mankind, of natural philosophy. So it's just prolific scholar type thing. So, and and he was strongly believed in common descent, and from chimps, so much so that he was made to recant. Okay, and he did not, and he somewhere along the line, but to the chagrin of Jefferson, he somewhere along the line, from studying fossils, he decided Americans were American flora and fauna was inferior, so much so that Jefferson got mad at him and had several soldiers dig up a skeleton of a bull moose and sent it to him, to saying that, yep, see, you may be a scholar par excellence, but you're wrong. So that was, so the idea of national superiority, filtered in paleontology as well, to an extent. So that just was just brings up interesting. So, okay, and again, so by the time, there was, so whole theory was based on temperature, that it was like, so that was very prevalent, and as I alluded to earlier, so that wasn't too far from the truth, as we are learning based on modern science type thing. So, and getting back to the second person, to if you read about any books of eugenics, okay, which will cover, hopefully for about an hour or so, that a guy named a German paleontology or a scholar named Johann Blumenbach, he was big into, anthropometry or measurement of skulls, and based on various appearance of skulls, he had classified human beings in 5 different races, again, more or less following, Linnaeus guideline. Okay, Africanus, Caucasian, Mongolian, American, and for some reason he had a different category of Malays. Okay, how he managed to all these skulls, because obviously there was enough intellectual communication that was going on between those places. Okay, and so, and again, by the time, the physician par excellence, Benjamin Rush, had his own ideas. You can see in the same time frame that the blacks or uh, African slaves were over-sexual, and they were immune to several diseases, for somehow that they were. And during the epidemic of yellow fever in Philadelphia, it's a lot of the uh, whites had left Philadelphia, and the free slave community, rose to the challenge and provided a lot of help to the infirm and sick. Okay, and at the same time, there were other people who were also quite prolific in deciding. An English physician who was actually well reputed and very reputed gynecologist, surgeon, from Manchester, and he had studied with none other than Hunter, who was the founding father of anatomical dissection and the Scottish anatomist surgeon and the Hunter brothers. So it studied with him. But at the same time, like he was interested in studying origin of human beings, and he had written on his how they found time to write all this. So there was an interesting account of gradation of the man too. So it was a very popular and well liked book about how, depending upon physiognomy, again, emphasizing as to how, you know, uh, Northern Europeans were at the top. So much so that after the statue of Apollo was found in archaeology in Greece, original statue was bronze, but it was remade. It was made in pure marble to make sure that yes, he was lily white, compared to similar skin tones as the Northern Europeans. And along with the slave trade, that it was considered exotic in specimen. And now, obviously, if you remember the Victorian style of dressing as to how women enhanced their backside, and the style of fashion was different. And when the European travelers started going to sub-Saharan Africa, they saw the African women, and obviously, there was not even racist, but they thought these women were naturally beautiful. They were gifted, so to speak. So they did not have to use padding to highlight their backside. Okay, so this was, now some person in Dutch, European farmlands in, Rhodesia or modern day South Africa, had hired a woman named Sarah Bartman, and had started showing her as a classic example of Hottentot. That was the name that the Dutch had given to the tribes, which was the Bantus and the native tribes of further south, in Central and Southern Africa. And so he had started showing her he had hired her and was displaying her as the idea of the African beauty, and as a Hottentot Venus. And not being satisfied, he thought there was a bigger market. So from Cape Town, he decided to bring her over Europe, and she was shown as an example of Hottentot beauty. So he tried to monetize her physical features. Okay. Okay. And not only that, obviously, along with that, human evolution is strongly affected by the urge to reproduce, and sex and race have been intricately connected, because obviously, it's well known that, that the plantation owners, considered their right, to have sexual relationship with their female slaves. And at the same time, they had the fear of the hypersexual black male. Okay, that they were, that was a stereotype was considered that, and that is one of the reasons why that they encouraged the lower class white who came as contract laborers to say to preserve that sanctity of the white women should be preserved, because, and that argument resonated even in 20th century, that when segregation of desegregation of schools was being debated upon, one of the senators from Alabama would said, okay, well, this desegregation of schools will open doors of your of the bedrooms where the sanctity of the white women would be violated. How those schools have tried in, so that, but there was, so again, so those ideas, continued, and the fear of uh, uh, mixing of races, was very inherent in the roots. And uh, a Jamaican African scholar named J.A. Rogers has written two big books about sex and race. And these are some amazingly well-researched book for those of you who are curious or about this subject. It goes back to the Arab slave trade, or Saracens trade, about the European women into the harems, and the other trade that goes on. So he talks about, how race and sex were intertwined, and with some very original research done in 1940s. And there are two big volumes, and they're both in public domain, so I think I would be happy to send the PDF to this thing. And again, so and the race for international marriage were passed almost in all state and stayed on books until very recently. And this you may get kick out of this thing, that this is like how the hybrid marriage was frowned upon. This is a medical paper from 1843, and this is the forerunner of the prestigious New England Journal of Medicine. It was called Boston Medical and Surgical Journal, and just the title alone would just make you think as to how turned about we were in science and medicine type of things. That, and obviously, the hybridization, for any good botanist, would tell you that actually it strengthens the species rather than weaken. Okay, and I think in a genetics class we may have talked about a guy named Burbank, who was a self-taught farmer and hybrider, on the West Coast. For him, Burbank is named after the city, and he was so prestigious that a lot of the who is who of Europe traveled specifically to California to meet him. So hybridization was considered great, on one extent for botany, but was strongly frowned upon when it came to human beings. Okay, and again, so, and this is, I think I will change the focus at this point, and probably you can just realize this is, some of you may have heard about this case, that this was the Loving, so that's just weird. My synapses snapped in. Virginia is not for lovers, and the couple Loving was actually arrested. The police broke into their bedroom when they moved back. They were married outside Virginia, and when they moved back, type of thing. So they were arrested, and the case went all the way up to Supreme Court to decide it, and it took several years for finally the laws to be modified. Okay, all right. I will stop for a while and see if anybody has any questions or comments. Okay. Anybody has any opinions, questions, comments, please chime in. Okay, and
Farad?
yes, please, go ahead.
So I remember reading somewhere that there was a papal edict about looking down on anybody that wasn't white, and that sort of is carried through to today. The idea that the church said that these people, as people traveled, like they could go to Africa, go to America with the indigenous people, just go, oh, we can enslave these people because they're not smart enough or whatever. And that whole thing of looking down on non-white people started with a thing from the church.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely, yeah. I mean, I don't know when you joined in, because I had the two slides earlier about the papal edict in 1493. The Portuguese were given blessing that yes, it's fair to,
But it came from I thought it came from the church. The
Yes,
papal,
it was, yeah, the several popes actually gave their blessing for it, when they divided the new word between, based on longitude between Portugal and Spain, so that was around the same time, so he not only just did the territorial thing, but also gave his green signal type thing, so and says go and along with converting these heathens that we know, and in fact, I think I have mentioned in some of my other classes when Vasco da Gama came to India, he looked at the temples and he thought, oh, those were churches. And then we came, not just for spices, but we also came to find Christians, type of thing. So,
Yeah,
and
Barat, I want Bruce, I think you're right about the papal edict, because I know that when priests were sent to the Caribbean, like the Dominican Republic and Haiti, and they had slaves there, and the priests and they were enslaved because they weren't human. The priests came to the conclusion that they had a soul, and they couldn't be slaves, and that this was a big revolt within the Catholic Church on the definition of what a human is. So originally the church assumed that the blacks weren't humans, and that they didn't have a soul. So that
absolutely,
but when they started trying to convert them to Christianity, they had to recognize that they had a soul.
It comes to that, just to say, wait for the next slide, type thing. I have they're called the children of Ham, so that's the thing. That's the next slide that's coming after this one. So these are, I should have put that one first, it's a little yellowish slide of an article of thing. So this is the book that's there. I'm just getting that. And in fact, I think
Barat, when was this papal edict? I couldn't find it in my notes. It was like 1500, some of that time.
Yeah, it was
Okay.
1452, I think, or something.
Okay, so I'm not.
It's in the.
It
was on the slide 30, 31 or 34 or something like that. So I think I just we just went over that. I think so.
Okay.
And I think, and what I'm going to do is I haven't given the book references that are there, but there are some fascinating books that I've, there is one book that I read, but it's based on purely on anthropology. Another book is purely just given on history of races all along. One book is on science. So it's just, so I think I have about half a dozen references that for those of you who are more curious or want to delve into the subject, so this is, so I think and I'll just digress, when Vasco da Gama went, type thing. So obviously there were Greek Orthodox Christians in India long before Vasco da Gama came in 1498, but they were the wrong kind of Christians. So he, so there was, even though there were Christians in Kerala and, other Portuguese colonies, they were the wrong kind. So he was, and with the conversion or the Spanish Inquisition, they were brutal, they really, they were just cruel even to other Christians type thing. They forcibly converted them. And if they didn't, they were burnt at stake, even in little colony of Goa. I mean, when I read that about type of thing, when I was doing my other classwork, I couldn't believe it, that they were not just happy with getting pepper and spices, but religion was a big this thing type thing. So they were, again, even among Christians, it's not like, because, doubting Thomas went to India long ago, but type thing, but there was the wrong kind of Christianity for them. So, and the roots of the Spanish Inquisition, extended even to the subcontinent of India. So that was just, it was shocking type thing. So, and that continued type thing, so that you had to be the devout Catholic type of thing. The Greek Orthodox were, not the right kind of Christians. Okay, so this is, again, for those of you who are East Coasters, I don't know if anybody has ever seen this museum. Okay, and I don't think any of you is from Philadelphia type of thing, but we should ask at the Rich's open this thing, the lady from Philadelphia, that we should ask if she has visited this, So, but he was, again, a fellow named Samuel Morton, so again, all the classes of eugenics, so he is mentioned as the founder, one of the big persons of American School of Anthropology type of thing. And again, so they followed the footsteps of what the Europeans had, type of thing. And he was, a physician, geologist, evolutioner, believed in, looked for human evolution. But again, he was a polygenic believer, as we thought about the two schools of thought that couldn't come to terms with each other. Like the humans have same origin or they're different. And so this was, so again, so he had a skull collection of about 1,200. And so he had correspondence with various paleontologists, anthropologists to all over British Empire and to Eastern Europe, and he had managed to acquire varieties of skulls and tried to make very scholarly studies based on the appearance of the skulls. So he had some skulls from China, obviously African collections, Europeans, Indians from East India Company officials. So the science was, really globalized even in those days, and based on that, obviously he had made to come to the conclusion that the Caucasian skulls were the best and on the top of the chain. Okay, so that was, and this collection is, and now that people, Stephen Jay Gould, looked at his data and he would said, okay, that some of his data or interpretations were kind of not falsified intentionally, but were misjudged type thing. So, but again, some of the more recent Penn graduate students have reassessed this thing, and said in terms of measurements, that Dr. Morton's measurements were absolutely correct. And Stephen Jay Gould, who was the well-known geneticist at Harvard, and had made a big impact on the theories of so-called punctated evolution. Okay, and he was in the wrong. So there is still some now. Obviously, the people whose skulls were this thing, so they were wondering as to how these gifts would be identified or buried, type of thing. So that's again, it's going to be a big this thing as to. But there's still, the collection is there at the part of the Penn Museum, the Samuel Morton's collection. So next time you're in Philadelphia, you can look that up if you're so curious. Okay, and this is, the book about, like, obviously I'm not, not religious, and this is, it goes to the story of the biblical tales of Noah's sons. And this thing was as to how Noah was naked, and one of his son looked at him. So they're called the Africans are the cursed, the sons of Ham. So there was a biblical root that was tried. So that's why they were cursed by God to be different and inferior type thing. So, and this is a book, believe it or not, this was written by a clergyman, type thing. So he was not the only one, but this is just thinking about, so about the next, it's hard to see it, type thing. So I think, but you can just see the biblical defense of slavery. So of the origin, history, and fortunes of Negro race. So you can just see that this continued not only in the 16th and 17th century, but the roots are. So they were trying to find a religious, basis for their beliefs. So the race became associated with the stereotype and justification for racism, type thing. So, and again, we have already referred to, the white slave trade that was going on, type thing. So, and we, I think a lot of you may know about as to how, that no one does not want to just, pick on religion all the time. But, there are people who actually had genuine change of heart. We talked about the clergymen who appealed to the King of Spain earlier. And similarly, like at Christmas time, there was some articles written about the man who wrote Amazing Grace. His name was also Newton. Okay, and he was a slave trader before, and somewhere along the line he had a change of heart, and he became a clergyman, and and that was the so he penned Amazing Grace. So there is a dramatic turnabout that can go about, and this has been like, I think obviously I'm not a religious I don't study religious philosophy, but it has been a problem with monotheism type of thing. As to on one hand, we consider people as equal, but at the same time, there's a conflict with the Enlightenment thinking as to how, you know, the white Europeans are at the top of the chain. So on one hand, they're trying to come in the trade as to, are we all equal or are we superior? And obviously, you know, so then we'll get more into the so-called scientific racism or Darwinism type of thing. So, okay, all right. Now, I think I'm going to have gone a little bit further type of thing. Now, I'm going to ask for the next hour. Would you want to go into the history of eugenics and other these things, or you want to get over some of the science of skin color? Okay, so I just, you know, because I want to mix type of things, so we can just say that, you know, I have like about 15 or 20 a set of slides for science of skin color. So if you are curious to know that first, you know, type of thing, I can certainly switch things around, and instead of this, I can bring on that other set of slides, you know, type of thing. So let's speak up as to what your preference would be. That otherwise we can go in a sequential type of phase, because the way I had arranged slides was I arranged slide from the historical perspective to go on to Darwin and other thinking, and then when we go to modern science, to go into the real science of race type of skin color, you know, because Darwin didn't have much knowledge about ultraviolet rays and vitamins and things of that nature. So I can do it whatever way you prefer type of thing. So
In the chat, there's a vote for skin color.
all right, okay, yep, okay, thank you, Lorraine. So I will do that. Yeah, okay, yeah. Thanks for pointing it out. Yeah, so yeah, I think because you can use a break, because I mean history is interesting, but I think at least half, you know, half of you are, you know, science-based, you know, career people type of thing. So I think let's mix and match type of thing. So let's do that type of thing. So I will. Okay, I think, and instead of waiting till, let me take a 5-minute break type of thing, and I will load up the other side, Paul. So it's a little earlier type of thing than we realized, but so I will load up the other slides, and I can even try to see if my Dell is happy with me, and I can try to see if I can log on to the other thing. So I'm going to mute. Okay, can you see me now?
Sorry, Brad, I stepped away. Go ahead. I think you look good.
Okay.
You may still have the volume up on your other machine.
Okay. Yeah, I'm going to mute it. Yeah. All right. Yeah. Okay. I think you should be able to see the slide now.
Yes, black and white, Evo Devo, and
Yep,
your
absolutely.
audio is
We're
good.
in business. Yeah, good. So, okay, so these are about 30 slides, for evolution of skin color. So now I can see, I mean, I'm back in business, so hopefully it won't kick me out, but I have the backup ready type of thing, so to speak. So this is, so we're good. Okay, so we'll wait for a couple of minutes and then we'll get started type thing. So, hi, Linda, okay, she's looking down. Okay, yeah.
Enjoying this. This is a wonderful course.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate it. So I think, so yeah, I don't know what we'll do about the other class because I have only like 4 people in the other class in person. And you are
Really?
at Allegro type thing because I think it's,
Oh,
yeah, so that's why I think I'm kind of, I may just ask Joseph what to do type thing because, it's a hike driving to Allegro, type
well,
of.
yeah, and I would like to have
I'm
taken
doing the
it.
same
but-
class on Zoom. I have more people on Zoom, same class.
Oh,
So
oh,
so I will run it by him, so and 2 or 3 are local and that's very, so I think I'm just, because I saw that you were on Zoom, on the other one, you're there in person. So it depends on where you live type of thing. So
well, but I live near Allegro and I would have preferred to
I
have
understand. I
Yeah,
understand that thing.
but
So
I had a conflict with another class. So I decided as long as you offer this by way of Zoom, I could do both.
oh yeah, exactly. Oh yeah, no, this is the whole thing because it's like, I can't take the classes, because I think I'm ticked off at Joseph. He doesn't send me the preprint catalog. Otherwise, I could have said, yeah, this attracts a similar crowd.
Yeah, yeah,
Cosmology classes at the same time. I could never take it. I wanted to take it because it said USF, now I would have taken it, but
Yeah.
it's the same thing,
It-
like.
It's really
The Beatles
surprising,
class is
Brad,
this
because
afternoon, so this is, so I have to really finish, and if I want to sign up, I have to go quickly. So,
Unison class is free for residents, right?
oh yeah, right.
Yeah, that's surprising.
Oh yeah, all the places they have, OLLI has a contract with these places that they have to provide 3 or 4 courses, except for Lake Magdalene. The church people, OLLI has to pay them for a class. They have to pay $150 for each class. By Unison gives, they don't have to pay anything, and in fact, they're wined and dined basically. So
Well, the
it's a
church
different
needs its
contract.
pound of flesh.
Yeah, exactly. Right. So I think it's this is, so I changed the theme for this thing, so it's like black and white Evo Devo, so type thing. So I think, I think John may still be there, but I think, he and I have exchanged enough emails about quantum biology. So I think I'm trying to make him a mathematician in spite of all. So he is not, he's a hard nut to crack. So, like, I think it's like, I talked to him about Eddington and Einstein yesterday. So, okay. Oh, actually, by the way, I think Peter, you may have seen the movie The Man Who Knew Infinity.
No, I haven't.
Oh, look it on Roku. It's on free. It's about. Mike, I'm sorry. I confused this Englishman. You all look alike to me. So this
We do, yeah.
Yeah. So he and Mike Hodges. We talked about Ramanujan. Ramanujan was a prodigy mathematician. Back in 1920, and he had studied some old books that were lying around. He was a clerk in Madras, and he sent his papers to Hardy, at that time. And Hardy was a Cambridge, dawn of mathematics, and says, "Oh, this is brilliant. This is original work in number theory." So he invited this guy, who is, and South Indian Brahmin, and he stayed in during the war in Cambridge and survived on potatoes and rice and eventually, and his work was so phenomenal that people are still trying to decipher his number theory things. He would just come up from so this is inspiration from gods or what have you. So people are still trying to decipher his books. So that was made into a movie starring the chap who did Slumdog Millionaire, Dave Patel. Okay, and Jeremy Iron plays the Hardy, the
Oh,
mathematician.
excellent. He's a great actor.
Yeah, so he's a great actor. So I think you'd enjoy that. It's called The Man Who Knew Infinity. It came out a few years ago. It was one of those. So I think you can catch it on Roku or something, or on your Netflix streaming or what have you. Yeah, you'll like it as to how the cultural thing is too. It's a nice movie. It's called, and because it's just like, the famous story is like 1729. Okay. They were riding in a taxi type of thing. And he said, oh, what a boring number, 1729. So Ramanujan said, no, it's a very interesting number. It's a sum of two cubes, 1,729. And another also cube. So it's like, his brain was wired differently. So it's a fascinating story that, I think,
But infinity is very easy to understand. Infinity plus 1 equals infinity.
yeah, exactly. So, that's how Feynman got this thing, because he devised the things on the quantum mechanics, so how to cancel out all the infinities. So that was the whole thing about the energy transfer in quantum physics. So that was the Feynman's way of thinking, so I think, so, anyway, so I think our 5 minutes are over. I think my clock says it's on our clocks is okay. Right. Is where we are seeing Al Carlson in virtue type of thing. So when Al comes back, we'll slowly get started.
Bharat?
Yes, please, go ahead. Oh,
I
hi,
just-
please.
Hi, I just wanted to mention a thought I had. You had put the AI summary, quote unquote, of your first talk
Yes,
on the OLLI kind of, I don't know what we call it, but the OLLI Facebook page, that's
Yes.
it. And I was really struck by how not a summary it was, how it was just a verbal regurgitating of pretty much everything you said. There was no thinking involved. There was no
oh yeah,
and analysis. And I wondered if you would put it up for that reason, just to show how poorly AI is doing thinking. It's just really just blabbing out what certain sentences. It's
Exactly.
actually, that's the frightening part to me, that we'll get to the point of not really curating ideas, just sort of
it's not.
just sort of repeating them. It's scary to even think about. I used to teach gifted children, and some of the ones, you'd ask them to do a summary, and that's the way they would do a summary. They thought that it was you just giving everything that happened was a summary, and not coming back and looking far away and picking the key points and what does this really mean? What is this about? None of that is in the AI quote unquote summary.
Yeah,
So is that, do you see that also?
Yes and no. Some of it is, I think the several of us in this class took a class in between that Bruce Gobioff and I did on neuroscience and artificial intelligence, and this was a 6-week class that we did, I should say in fall. Okay. And, we had a lot of discussion on type things. So, and it's like, it's, and we can just say AI is kind of a mysterious thing. And it is, it's like, obviously it's just like children. It makes up things as it goes along, or like the human brain, it makes up things as it goes along. But at the same time, it can come up with very innovative solutions that you and I would have not thought about. So it's like a Pandora's box, sometimes it could have flashes of brilliance. At the same time, it can look totally stupid. So it's
very much like humans.
Exactly. So this is, it's just like, you remember the game that Watson did with Jeopardy. Okay. I mean, it was brilliant. It crushed, Ken Jennings and other people. But the last question was given. He answered Toronto. The question was about, about America. And Toronto is not part of, there was not, so it's totally misinterpreted. So it's just like, in the same way, the recent thing, I don't know how much you've been keeping up with this, like the Chinese game of Go, that the guy who lost it, just saying, well, this moves he would have never thought of type of thing. So it's just like,
So it can be brilliantly creative, at the same time can be got hallucinate, just like, just like a people who have had a stroke on brain, they will just imagine, oh, they'll make up a thing, they will draw the clock with half a face, and they'll say, oh no, I mean, this doesn't exist, type of thing. So how brain can confabulate. So it is absolutely scarily like human brain. So just to answer that. But so no, I think it was a very interesting class, and and I think between Bruce and I, we had some fun, because he handled it from the computer science point of view, and I did the neuroscience point of view. So we had, I think it was well received. All right, okay. So I think 5 minutes are up. So I think we have a couple of people. Kevin had to drop out, and a few people are not in their chairs. So I think we will get into some of the science of, if everybody can hear me and see my slides, I would imagine. Yes. Okay. This is a different set of slides that I just got a little carried away. I had only like 5 slides, but this is really real science behind our appearance. Because as we talked about, we are all creatures, we rely on our eyes more than testing. So, and the earlier scientists or philosophers were, as I mentioned in the last hour, that there is some biological basis to climate thing, So this is where the science comes into the thing, because obviously, they were limited by their resources because they did not have microscopes, and they could not, they did not have spectroscopy and what have you, And obviously, the real science had not taken off. It is more of a product of 20th century. Okay, and you've seen this slide, that this was the early hominins, and the reason why I put that in again, because the fossils, don't have any skins, type of thing. But based on genetic evidence, the Lucy chimp, but they looked at the genome from the old bones, and based on that analysis, thought their skin was not black underneath, it was more of a pinkish, as you can see from this, next picture that is coming up. And because, but again, they had short legs, as you can see, and was walked with a waddling type of gait, and not the biggest runner. But the big advantage was to protect from the elements, had hair all over, so hairy chimp. And those of you who grew up in the 60s, remember the book by Desmond Morris called Naked Ape. Okay, so I think it was a pretty, kind of somewhat racy book for that time, but he was right on, He talked about the evolution, way before some of these fossils and genomic evidence came about, So so the original skin, okay, and as you can see from this slide, so this is a very interesting slide. A lot of this work is by a renowned scientist named Nina Jablonski. So these are her slides. So, and she has done a lot of the original work on skin color and some of the thinking as to see how, 7.5 million years ago. So this is how hairy our ancestors, our ape ancestors were, to getting back how we lost the hair, but at the same time, the skin changed, the hairy timeline. Okay, the skin was, okay, let me move this. Okay, okay, okay. Okay, I think I'm going to move. Okay, yeah, now I can move this away, because all the faces were blocking my notes. Okay, now I can read my note. This was a hairy timeline. Skin was lightly colored. And then when we get down to modern Homo turcana, okay, boy, the Turkana boy, 1.5 million years ago, he was a good runner, okay, and he was running naked and sweaty, and he had long legs. He could not climb very well, but he was a runner. So it's just like, the Descartes thinking, I think, therefore I am. But if you go back further into millions of years, we have to say, I sweat, therefore I am. And just to say, the famous album, Born to Run, he was born to run. And that's one of the things that the geneticists, like in groups, a bunch of human hunters can run down an impala, okay? And there are people who have actually tried to outrun a horse, basically. because the horse would pant, they just don't have the sweating ability. But, the humans were, our body, the bipedalism was such a big gift, that it was worth the risk of being a prey. And the strong gluteus maximus is the bottom muscle. And so this was, biggest evolutionary advantage that came across. Okay. Okay, and this is, just the basic anatomy 101 type of thing. If you take the cross section of your human skin, that we have the pigment, the do one and all of, called melanin pigment, which is underneath the skin, which is secreted by a special group of cells called melanocytes, and that's what gives it the color. As you can see how it's underneath the layers, and and that's what decides what the skin color is, so that is all the controversy that is there because of the melanin. Okay, and this is, inside the melanocytes, are just surround, released outside in the nucleus. You can see the pigmented cells, there are things. So this is one of the appearance type thing. Okay, and again, this all boils down to, as we talk about the climatic changes, where the ultraviolet rays have a lot to do with it. And the best data that is available is from NASA, from the satellites. They were studying the ozone layers. They had collected the data from the satellites in the upper atmosphere of the annual ultraviolet radiation. As you can see, based on the color coordination, type of thing, as to high UV, in the center of the Earth, the ellipsoid Earth type thing. So it goes through the equator, a huge amount of ultraviolet rays, as you can see it. And so that is detrimental, to the human skin. As you very well know, that exposed to the UV rays, you would not only burn, but, with prolonged exposure, and you're risking skin cancer. Okay. And the high UV ray is not only just near the equator and Tibetan plateau, but it's less in Mediterranean. So this was the NASA data, so this was done based on something called spectrometer. Okay, and again, the South, it's similar in the South American desert, the Atacama desert, that's very little radiation up north. Okay, and again, this shows, in a lot more detail as to high UV, the color coded chart. So it's pretty, so this is a very interactive video about the biology of skin color. This is the Howard Hughes Medical Research Institute. So, and there are three types of ultraviolet rays. We get down to the optics or physics of it. They have different frequencies. Ultraviolet, say, so they have different nanometer, B, A, different frequencies. The C is absorbed in the atmosphere, upper atmosphere, but the A and B do penetrate. Okay, and the A is the one dangerous type thing. So it can, and the different types of melanin. Melanin by itself is a natural sunscreen, and it's been recruited many times. It has evolved. So, but you can just see there are three different types of ultraviolet rays. So it's the physics of it is more complicated than you realize. Okay, and this is eumelanin, is the natural sunscreen protector. See, it's inside the cells. As you can see, these little pigments that are layered around. Okay, and it's in many species, humans can make polymers of it, so it unites and it protects you from the harmful effect of the UV rays. Okay, and these are the so-called melanosomes type. So, and there are two types of melanin, which are called eumelanin and pheomelanin. Okay, and this is, for the chemist amongst you, so this is the chemistry, which is, don't sweat too much into it, but it gets down to one of the essential amino acids, and it is converted by various enzymes, and you may recognize the DOPA, which is the thing. So, and it eventually, the pathways, it continues just, into eumelanin, which is the darker pigment, and the pheomelanin, which is not that great at protecting you, that thing. So, and it also protects you from the so-called reactive oxygen species, okay, the so-called free radicals type thing, so that can cause the damage. And you can see how this again shows the examples as to how the A and the B penetrates as to different layers type of thing, so it can get past, the B is, stopped at this thing, but the A can get down further and can cause damage. Okay, Now, that was well known, and it's consistent, a lot more scientific, but it follows the so-called Aristotelian earlier thinking as to climate. But not only that, it is a lot more than that. Okay, but now one can say that the cancer now occurs at a later age type of thing. So, but at the same time, it has effect not just DNA damage, but it also has big role in the so-called folate metabolism. And this is the new finding that is recent that, as you can see, this is Dr. Jablonski's paper, and it's in terms of scientific research, it's not that old, so this data is not only last, they started thinking as to why this gene, has remained present type thing. So it has an effect on folate metabolism, which has, it has a relationship on evolutionary basis. Okay, so if your dietary sources of folate, jeopardy abundant, the green leafy vegetables, okay, and legumes, and so this is the role. Folate is required for DNA production, DNA repair, and DNA methylation. Okay, and this is how you started out as, basically. So this was the earlier embryonic pictures, so like this is the earlier appearance of the neural crest or crest state. Okay, so this is at earlier during evolution, that neural crescent forms that goes on to develop into the spine and a cord. So this is why we are considered chordate. So we have the spine and the bilateral symmetry that later develops. And if there is not enough folate in the early stages of pregnancy, you get a defect called spina bifida, and the so-called neural tip defects. They're pretty harmful to evolution, and the baby would not survive, that thing. So it is again, so it is very important to get the earlier folate metabolism. Okay, so the cell division from the moms, so 70% of that can be damaged due to folate deficiency. So that is one of the so-called selective forces on evolutionary basis. That's why, this thing is, this shows the example as to how, these go on to develop into various, spinal disc divisions that takes place. Okay, so this is the important part. Okay, you can see how the shape is taking place, and at the further end, the area bulges out and goes on to develop into human brain. Okay, so this is, so this is based on the evolution and evolutionary sweep that takes place. So darkly pigmented skin resulted from a selective sweep and eliminating variation in the melanocortin gene. Okay, so melanocortin gene that has a locus, so-called receptor, has gone on to develop into two different types of melanin that comes about. Okay, and also and the pheomelanin gives out reactive oxygen species, which is the precursor of cancer outside Africa. So depigmented people, are a lot, we wouldn't say white people, but depigmented people are at a much higher risk for skin cancer. And in fact, so much so that when the English settled Australia, they had, it's an amazingly high incidence of skin cancer because of sports-loving Australians type of thing. So you're actually, so this was up north, the UVA goes through, and the UVB is the one needed. So this is how, the bad genes have been preserved. And again, this I showed you this earlier. Now, the beneficial effect of when there is not enough ultraviolet radiation, the vitamin D is necessary for forming, it's not just important for your bones, but for everything else, the vitamin D is an essential factor. So there is a so-called evolutionary compromise that has taken place, because you need, when there is, not enough the sunshine, you need this enough penetration of the UV rays to make essential nutrient, which is vitamins, so how the rays penetrate in the dermis, or from the, okay. So ultraviolet, on one hand, it causes damage. On the other hand, vitamin D production by ultraviolet B. So this is the so-called evolutionary trade-off, because without vitamin D, you not only get, rickets, but it's also important for your cardiac function, kidney function. Okay, so this was, a bigness, and the formation of teeth, bones. So it's a tremendous evolutionary, trade-off that has taken place with our evolution. And you can see how rickets is now, obviously with better diet, it has improved, but these are some of the earlier pictures. So this is, how the kid would be deformed. Okay, and not only that, this is not just a matter of appearance. The biggest important that occurs is the female pelvis with severe rickets. So how you can see that the narrow pelvis would be literally a reproductive disaster that would take place. Okay, you can see there's no way a large baby's head could get out of this deformed pelvis. Okay, so this would be, and also not only that, vitamin D has effect on your immunity. Okay, so there is a biological compromise that has taken place, and with human adaptation, type of thing. On one hand, the cancer occurs at a much greater rate. So, and there are varieties of genes that play a role in different parts of the world. It's like, amongst Europeans, there are, now this is again, these are so-called polymorphisms, and there are individual changes that take place, and variety, these are some of the genes for people like John who would be interested. This is the sodium channel gene, and some of the other genes, which are, now it's a tyrosine gene, which we talked about for, and how big they are, this kilobases and other stuff, but that gets into very complicated genetics type of things. So we won't get too much into it. So this is how this is, the genes have been preserved, and, and especially if, and not just enough that if you live way further north, that you're not, in spite of, being depigmented, you're not getting enough vitamin, not making enough vitamin, nurture has changed, because the people's diet have changed, because that is why there is preference for, fatty fish, okay, up in the northern climates. We go to the Arctic Circle, or even to go to Scotland, where there is, even, throughout, even in summer, there is not enough exposure to ultraviolet rays. So the diet has evolved to include fish that are high in vitamin D. Okay, and so that's one of the things as to how they're people who have grown up, or selectively grown up in that region, they can tolerate it. On the other hand, there was a case that, a bunch of explorers were marooned, near the Arctic Circle, and they gorged themselves on liver of seal, and they all died of vitamin D toxicity. Okay, but that same diet was well tolerated by the Inuit or the Eskimos. So there's, that's how, human habits and diet has affected, our intake of essential nutrients. So this is, and this is the device that it measures the skin pigmentation, it's called spectrometer type thing. So, okay, and again, great thought. Oh God, no God, something fishy plus liver. So this is vitamin D compromised at work, and so ultraviolet rays, even in June, it's relatively low. So that's how the diet evolved. And again, you can just see skin pigment, mutation is an evolutionary compromise, as you would say. Okay, photosynthesis of vitamin D, photoprotection, okay, photosynthesis. So it's an evolutionary, trade-off type of thing. So we can say, in God we trust, or you can just go on and modify it. Then in evolution, we trust. When you get down to, obviously, I'm not, so one can have both at the same time. But this gives you the more scientific thinking, because obviously, so this is just a bunch of slides that I put together from, and thanks to the great pioneer research. And it's interesting, when Dr. Jablonski did the study, her husband worked for NASA and was great at interpreting all this data. So it was a joint collaboration between husband and wife. So this was some brilliant work, and she has made the case as to how this is, so she says, obviously there's no black and white, but it's a gradient that takes place type of thing as to how evolution has done wonders in terms of. Okay, so this is, the famous statement that I quoted earlier, Theodosius Dobzhansky. He was an evolutionary biologist. Nothing in biology makes sense except in sense of evolution. So this is the set of slides that I had for evolution. So we'll just stop here for a second. I will load up my other slides. And for stop by, I think few of you have dropped out. So I think I will see if anybody has any questions or comments, while I boot up the other slides. Okay, let me move. Okay, good. We didn't freeze this time, so that was good. Okay, let me find where my slides are. I think I have to move all of you first. Okay, science of race. Where did it go? Okay, I have too many things on my screen. Okay, it opened up. Okay, good.
Bharat, I think we had what you wanted for a while, then.
Oh yeah, I'm getting that, so okay.
Okay.
Yeah. So I wanted to make sure that I had the. Okay, you got the slide now?
Yeah, racial concept of disease.
Yes. Oh, okay. Yeah, got it. Yeah. So this is, so we took a little, detour in terms of, going over this thing. So, okay. So we, so you've got some idea about the science that goes on behind the skin. So this is, but again, we stopped somewhere along the line. So we didn't have a whole lot of microscopy and molecular science in these days. So varieties of ideas just continued basically. And this is another physician who was in America. So he, obviously he was a Southern gentleman. And so not only that, he went around and created his whole idea about the report on the diseases and peculiarities of the Negro race, and this is, it almost makes you, I'm sorry, go ahead, Bruce, you had a question, please.
I was going to raise the question and you answered it for this guy, but how many of the scientists that have come up with along the way came up with their theories were doing it objectively to learn something or to use their research in order to justify their community's opinions?
I think it's hard to get data on it, So I think, a lot of people, they thought that they were doing, real science type of thing. It's just like, I think you may, in science, you start out with a lot of theories which are so-called falsifiable, and I think maybe John or Peter can elaborate more on it type thing. So, they're not necessarily malicious, but they actually genuinely believe that they are, and that's just how, just give an example like stomach ulcers, we all believed it was all due to stress, until, and I think, there is also
this guy in the South, the guy that worked for the government doing eugenics, seems like there are a lot of scientists that were during that time period that were coming up ways to justify why racism was okay.
Well, some of it may have to do with like, I'll get into the part, there was a guy named Luis Agassiz, and he was much more part of some of his theory was influenced by religion, but at the same time, he was a very highly respected scientist in his days, like he had, he was professor at Harvard and then he was at Stanford. So A lot of people had, and it occurs something like, that maybe somebody else can comment, like something called paradigm shift that takes place until the
Right.
evidence is fortified, like there was the thinking of Thomas Kuhn. And the classic example that we gave you for stomach ulcers, we just, thought when I was in medical school, people drank, we were say, oh, take milk and relax, that's how you get in the ulcer. You have too much stress. You see any movie from the 60s, they're all taking milk, too much stress. But there was all proven wrong. So and it took, the same way for Newtonian physics, like, not that people who didn't believe Einstein were not necessarily malicious. They just thought, oh, he hadn't done enough experiments. So that was a classic example as to how, in my other class, I'm going to talk about as to how that's why they thought the Swedes, they were not exactly, they were not, obviously, maybe subconsciously they were anti-Semitic, but they genuinely thought, oh, he hadn't done enough experiments, like other people had to prove the general theory of relativity, So they were not necessarily, I would say, in defense of them, that it takes a while to change conventional thinking that gets set, type of thing. So, and even in the believing it, like some of the earlier geneticists were also, not Darwinian type of thing. So it's like, and then they change their thinking. So it takes a while for, things to turn around. So, but and I'm sure there may be subconscious bias type thing. It's like you find what you're looking for, so to speak, sometimes. So, okay, so and I think that the real scientists, I'm just a, I study. I practice applied science, so I can't say, but I think the two real scientists can comment upon it if they choose to do so, like John and Peter would. They've done, this, so they can chime in on it. So this was, but obviously, so he.
Scrofula. What is the disease scrofula?
Yeah, so yeah, this is, like, that's skin disease, scrofula type. There was a skin tuberculosis, tuberculosis of the skin, scrofula. I think, this drags my memory. So you're testing me, I think, because I haven't thought about TB for a long time. So I think it's a, cutaneous tuberculosis, if I'm not mistaken. I think that's what scrofula, I think so. So this is, so variety, like theses was considered, tuberculosis. So there are varieties of names, I think. So scrofula is, I don't think it's a venereal disease, I think it's a cutaneous TB type thing, that if my memory serves me right, type thing. So, okay. So this was, a variety of things. So this was like, and he had made up some diseases. So he was totally, I think he was trying to justify his belief. So he was totally off the wall type of thing, is that disease that causes blacks to run away type of thing. So, and so this is, and okay, and also varieties of names that were given type of thing. That I had a partner who was actually, this was back in the 80s. He used to diagnose neurasthenia. It's like, this was just like, people had, had rapid heartbeat and other stuff. So, but now we have learned that there was totally different diagnoses. So some of the medical thinking can be totally out of date and continues. So this is, and this is a book that has, an African American researcher has written. So this did not just continue, it continues even in the modern days. So her testing is, it's a very erudite and well-worked book by Linda Villarosa, The Hidden Toll of Racism in American Lives and Health. So how racism continues even in the current medical establishment. Because, you look at a lot of papers, they were classified, how many people were Caucasian and how many people were, and only finally within last year or so, the American Medical Association said that this way of classifying your data collection doesn't hold water, that we are not making much sense because of so much mixing racing. But you'd still a lot of paper. So you would say, how many subjects were Asian or Caucasian, so that classification, still you'd read in a lot of medical papers, Okay, so this is, and even now, this sort of higher mortality continues even amongst rich African American women. And she gives an example how Serena Williams, who is about, as much of a celebrity African American as you can get. After delivering her baby, she was having symptoms, and her symptoms were being downplayed. And she finally insisted that, hey, this is like, I've had this blood clots in my lungs before. This exactly feels like, do some testing. So she had to really put pressure down to get tested, to finally, and sure enough, she had recurrent pulmonary emboli, or blood clots as a complication type of thing. So it was, so this sort of things, yes, continued even amongst, and the maternal mortality is higher even amongst rich African American women. Okay, so it's like, so the number game is not, okay, nothing to be sneezed at, and so, and again, type of thing. So that the talk that was done, that it was the sort of false beliefs that were given in medical students, that the African Americans have higher threshold for pain, they're tougher skin, okay, type thing. And also the data that was collected based on relatively small amount of earlier papers, that the lung function test, okay, so there has to be correction to be made for race, okay. And when people looked at the original papers, that was based on a relatively small number of data. And the same data comes when we investigate kidney function, okay. That kidney function assessment has a varieties of formula that was used. And there was a correction that was applied for race, okay. And as again, you can see that there was, and why is that significant? Because it was based on that, it was decided as to whether you would be put on list for kidney transplant or not. So that type of data manipulation, or that was done based on race, that has done a big disservice, to the African American community. And again, the mortality after cesarean section in Harlem was worse than that of Bangladesh. Okay, so it was, so it was not just, and obviously in a rich country there was, matter of this thing. So, okay, and obviously now this slide needs no introduction to the biologist there. Okay, so this goes down. Okay, that we are coming down to the point where while the birth of molecular biology that took place, when the Darwin, took his own sweet time and finally wrote his book in was tome on origin of species, and on the other side in Eastern Europe, Gregory Mendel was doing his research, and I alluded to earlier that originally, that the impetus of research was trying to breed better quality of sheep, okay, and then he moved on to doing breeding research on rats. And then the monks, the abbot of, and he was at an abbey that thought it wasn't very good for a monk to be working on breeding rats and forcing them to have sex, so he switched to peas, and which was a wiser choice, that finally and it was the birth of so-called Mendelian genetics as to whether dominant or recessive, and so that was the start of but again, that science was lost for, almost, I should say, 30 to 40 years, and he did his work, I should say, in 1879 or 80s or something like that, and then finally was rediscovered by a Dutch scientist named Hugo de Vries. Okay, and then finally, obviously, then they read some of the papers of his, and he was given credit for his work. But at the same time, Darwin, working in England or Britain, wasn't aware of it, So but he had alluded to how heredity was transmitted by what he had hypothesized, something called gammules that I talked to, and then subsequently the other biologist, so again, the guy named Huxley who defended, obviously this was a big controversy in those times because obviously this was the Victorian era, so the controversy as to creationism, and this was obviously, he was frowned upon by the clergyman who was responsible for anti-slavery movement in Britain, the British Empire, named William Wilberforce. And so Huxley debated William Wilberforce, you know, as to on evolution. He defended Darwin's theory, you know, much before it happened, you know, in Tennessee. And so this was, and so he was considered, you know, quote unquote, you know, Darwin's bulldog. Okay. And so, and this was finally, you know, after the advent of these two pioneers of molecular biology, one can say that this was the so-called end of polygenism. Okay, that the theory of multiple origin of human species in different parts of the world, you know, was, you know, finally, at least among the scientific community, the people, some of the fringe people still continue to believe that. Okay, yeah. And again, I mentioned a little bit about Luther Burbank, and you know, this is the Darwin Medal. Okay, and this was again, you know, Darwin did not mention, you know, in human and race and this thing in the origin of species in the early work. Okay, and later on, and he favored local adaptation, you know, and he, you know, he was talking, when he talks about race, he's primarily talking about plants and animals, you know, which are genetically distinct, you know. Okay, then later on, you know, he and no, he wrote another big book which is not as well known, called Descent of Man, you know, which had sort of a little poor reception type thing. But again, you know, in that he did not, you know, make a claim that the races were solely separate type this thing. Okay, and again, you know, this change afterwards as to make a lot of people took his ideas and started misinterpreting that. Okay, and that was the rise of eugenics, and it's so much so that his grandson or great grandson, I think it was grandson, man named Major Leonard Darwin, he goes on in early 20th century in 1911, okay, becomes the president of the Eugenics Society, okay, and that was the moment that was, you know, we'll talk more about it as we go along, and then, and again, you know, and again, you know, obviously it was not, it was eugenics means good breeding, so to speak. So the idea was, okay, that, you know, based on heredity, we could improve human race. So one can see, but how the whole idea went extrapolated into, yes, not only, you know, it would encourage good breeding into saying eliminate the bad one, and that morphed into all the way within a very short span of 30 years into genocide. So how the science got turned around from quote unquote good intention of good breeding into a dramatic worsening of wiping out a whole, you know, a huge number of people, to leading to genocide as to how it got misinterpreted. And obviously, you know, and it was not just restricted to Europe, but it had ramifications all over the world. And obviously, the whole thing was earlier thrust was that the superior people should have more children. Okay, and that, so this was the earlier thinking on the British side. But the French, you know, and as enlightened as they were, a French scientist named Charles Richer, okay, he went on to that extent way before the Nazis came to power, that hereditary defect children should be killed. Okay, and his book again was popular. This was called Selection Humane. Okay, so that just makes you cringe as you talk about. And this is, you know, this was the Darwin's Code. Okay, let's see, from his work on the descent of the man. Yep, that's the next work that I referred to a little while ago. Arguments treating races as distinct species. So you can just say he was way ahead of his time. They graduate into each other. So like the great shading of the paint, as we talked about independently, have intercross more carefully type thing. So, and he was confused as to looking at various scholars behind him, the single. And so he really did his work, you know, as to see how many races there are. So it's, you know, it's like all these people, thinkers who came before him could not come up to mind, you know, type thing, you know. Then these are some who is who of thinking that comes around, you know, some of the names I alluded to. Immanuel Kant, Blumenbach, Buffon, Hunter, who was British, Louis Agassiz, he was a Swiss biologist or zoologist who later on migrated to United States. Okay, and then again, so you can just see that the numbers are this is exponential. So there was a total disagreement or chaos amongst the so-called experts. Okay, and this again morphed into the so-called social Darwinism. So now to his credit, he never said the face survival of the fittest. This was coined by another biologist, was highly reputed in Britain, named Herbert Spencer. Okay, and so that just totally it changed the thinking as to how, and obviously this was, one has to put it in proper frame, that this was at the time of, the Industrial Revolution was just coming into more and more picture, and and the cities of Britain were getting populated by people from, there was a huge migration of the population that was taking place, and the services were, taxed to the max type of thing. Something what we are seeing similar now. And so this was put into, it's like how the unfit are crowding, and obviously, and during the Irish famine, it was that laissez-faire policy was in vogue of capitalism, and various theories of Adam Smith and other stuff, where these things said, let the unfit people die. And that was the things. And on the American side, there was an American economist named William Graham Sumner, and he was the early opponent of so-called welfare state. And this again gets down into the, struggle for resources, that the individual competition, was a tool for eliminating the weak and immoral. Okay, and again, and at the same time, this was pan-European phenomenon. In France, there was a man called Georges Lepouge, who measured the skulls and devised, okay, the struggle for, and he, had, and some of the other people had coined phrases way before the Nazis. Okay, this was, the German phrase "Kampf Raum" led to, means living space, the struggle for space. That was the phrase that he had coined. That led into the phrase Lebensraum that you may be familiar from reading the Nazi history. And this is the climate in which, Adolf Hitler was born around, and he absorbed some of these thinking, and obviously, so, and this at the same time, historically there was a huge influx of Jewish population of Vienna was exploding, and this again, it's almost hard to believe that there was a son of rabbi, a guy named Max Nordau, and he had written a 660-page book about degeneracy, okay, in Austro-Hungarian Empire at that time, as to how it was lamenting, the moment in art, Impressionism, Industrial Revolution, and obviously, the thrust was to go back to the folkish ways. And so these are some of the cultural and anthropological or social roots of the thinking that evolved into a Holocaust or genocide. Okay, and at the same time, like there were other on the U.S. side, there's a geologist in favor of the dominant race, controlling everything, all the resources, and that was, so that led to a strong opposition of Reconstruction. Okay, and various other philosophers, emphasize thinking, like a philosopher in Germany, and a social scientist named Max Weber. He emphasized the importance of Protestant work ethic. And at the same time, there was a mad rush for Africa that was taking place. And when they traveled to the small African kingdom of Benin, they saw the Benin massacre, as to how the tribal warfare was going on, type of thing. And so that again reinforced that their, beliefs that yes, that these people were inferior races and they need to be eliminated. So there are varieties of factors that were coming together in time, I think so. Okay, let me see if I can go any further. So yeah, so and And again, a lot of these geneticists, you know, that were there in the earlier part, no, they were strongly believing into so-called social Darwinism. And this is again, this is a cartoon for the Gilded Age as to how the rich the rubber barons, you know, were keeping, you know, making sure that they're well. And again, you know, there's a quote from the book Great Gatsby, okay, as to how it's like it's all, you know, it's all proven. It is a book written by, scientifically proven, the book by a fellow named Goddard, who wrote about how the inferior races of Central and Southern Europe were polluting the gene pool of white Western European Americans. Okay, so this is a quote. So, you know, so Scott Fitzgerald obviously was attuned with what was in the work for eugenics movement. And so there was a reference to that, you know, so that may come as a surprise to the literature runners type thing. So, okay. And again, this, I think I already showed you this slide earlier type of thing. So this was, I think this is the older slide. Okay, and these were the two people. They could not be, there were two scientists, how they can be totally on the opposite side. You can see that they are more or less contemporary. You know, Agassiz is older, but again, you know, they were, you know, in considered who is who of American science, anthropology, paleontology, zoologists. And Louis Agassiz was actually a Swiss zoologist, and he had later on migrated to US and was appointed a professor of science at Harvard. And he was a strong, again, you know, but he had a strong religious bent, and he never accepted the idea of Darwin's evolutionary theory, because obviously, you know, his own personal bias, you know, was strongly influenced his scientific thinking. And so he strongly continued to believe in polygenism and inferiority of the other races other than white. And he continued to be the strong proponent of so-called eugenics. And and he had a huge influence. And perhaps, you know, because of this, you know, now a lot of his names, things that were named after him at Harvard and on the West Coast at Stanford are being renamed. Okay, so some of the halls and statues that were built for him at you know, at Stanford and Harvard have been put in the storage. On the other hand, there was a German immigrant named Franz Boas. He was several years younger, but again, he was a contemporary of him at Columbia, and he was a strong believer in monogenism, in strong Darwin, and he had a huge influence, you know, on terms of he had done original research among a lot of Native American tribes in near the Arctic Circle, and he was who is who in anthropology at the Ivy League universities. Okay, and again, you know, he had done, you know, collected enough data on new immigrants that, you know, they will mix soon. You know, it's, you know, that the fear that was there about their language and their appearance, okay, and that was overblown. So his thinking was totally different, and he had huge influence on modifying the whole shift of the American School of Anthropology, and had written a book about called The Minds of the Primitive Man, and his students went on to influence. And the one that obviously you may have heard about, you know, was a well-known anthropologist named Margaret Mead. Okay, and at the same time, you know, and now we talked about now these people were paleontologists and zoologists, but at the same time at Columbia, the big pioneer of American genetics was a guy named Thomas Morgan. He did the research on fruit flies, and he was the Nobel winner for proving a gene as the structure of heredity. And originally he was skeptical about the Darwin's theory, but later on, obviously, he changed his ideas. And again, you know, he was strongly opposed to eugenic movement in the United States. So there were, you know, so there were a lot of schools of thought going on in American thinking about eugenics of, okay. And again, you know, how did the word, you know, Caucasian beauty was the idea, was still, you know, well commercialized, you know, and in fact, Barnum and Bailey was not, no, was out into monetizing. So he had recruited, Circassians. They are poor, but their daughters are beautiful, and they are traded to the Turkish sultans. Okay, and one of those wealthy enough to purchase this maidens are very honorably, virtually instructed into looking after men, taught various dances, very effeminate, and so he had tried to monetize that by showing this one woman who actually was not, Circassian, and he'd made a lot of money out of showing her as to how, titillating the men who had this idea of the Turkish harem is considered, and this again, gets down into, it boils down to the theme of sex and, sex and race as to how we saving the white women from slavery. And again, this goes on into the cultural milieu of abduction from Sarajevo and the Mozart plays. So, and so this is, a variety of things. So it had a huge influence on, the cultural scene. Okay. And at the same
In the
time,
early 1900s, a young man was held prisoner at the Bronx Zoo. Put on display like an animal, he was a unique attraction for the zoo. He was human, but unlike any visitors had ever seen before. His teeth razor sharp and pointed like some kind of real-life vampirism. The man also stood at just 4'11" and carried around a small bow and arrow. When not locked in enclosures with chimps and orangutan, he would roam the zoo, often scaring unsuspecting zoogoers, which I think the bow and arrow helped with a lot. But who was this mysterious man? Where was he from? And how did he come to be a human zoo exhibit? Like every good story, this one begins with a guy called Samuel. Samuel Phillips Werner was a legit crazy person from South Carolina. After having a mental breakdown, he decided to become an explorer. It was 1895, and much of the world had already been explored. So to satisfy his sense of adventure, Werner would need to go somewhere dangerous and hard to reach. It was not long before he chose a destination, the Congo. At the time, almost all of Africa had been invaded and colonized by European empires. Still ongoing at the time, this process was known as the Scramble for Africa. With vast wealth on the line, the major powers desperately took as much land as possible. In 1870, just 10% of Africa was under European control. By 1914, it was more like 90%. The most successful colonizers by far were the French and British, which I find very surprising. Of all the countries in the world, I would never expect it to be those two. Less powerful nations were largely blocked from claiming any land in Africa, at least in any significant way. Yet by pure fluke of diplomacy, Belgium got the Congo, one of the largest and most wealthy territories on earth. Belgium was a tiny state with a tiny military to match. So on the surface, it may seem to have no business in Africa, but because the British, French, Portuguese, and Germans all wanted to control the Congo, Belgium was able to step in as a mediating force. It was agreed Belgium would control it, but allow other nations to do business within the Congo. But it was not colonized in the standard way. Rather than formally being absorbed into Belgium, the Congo was legally owned by the Belgian King Leopold. The entire country was considered the personal property of Leopold, to do with as he pleased, and unfortunately he was a complete psycho, forcing native Congolese to extract rubber from the jungle. Any who did not meet their rubber quota would be brutally punished. Corruption was rampant, rebellions common, and the entire region infamous across the globe. This is the world Samuel Phillips Werner was venturing into. Despite having no experience as an explorer, he was ordained and made an official missionary to the Congo. It's hard to imagine him converting many locals, since, as I said, he was crazy. Reports are inconsistent, but he seems to have spent most of his time adventuring, exploring new areas and training newly discovered species of animal. Apparently, he became a father while in the Congo, which is not surprising. He was, after all, in a missionary position. But in 1899, he abandoned the life of a missionary, returning to America with some pet chimpanzees. Word of his travels soon spread, and he came to be known as an expert on the Congo, and especially on the pygmies. Werner had encountered many pygmy tribes and was familiar with their customs. So in 1903, he was sent back to Africa, this time contracted by a zoologist, paid to bring a group of African pygmies to the US. A World's Fair was said to be held in St. Louis the next year, with native groups from all over being put on display. But even among all the others, pygmies would be a special attraction. There was big money on offer if Werner could transport some successfully. While traveling to a pygmy village he had been to before, he encountered a team of native slave traders. Slavery was illegal at the time, but with no Belgian military presence in the more remote areas of the Congo, there was little to stop it from actually happening. By chance, those slavers had a pygmy with them, a teenager called Ota Benga. Unlikely as it is, Benga would go down in history as a tragic figure. Years before, his village was attacked by a militia, for reasons that are not known. The entire village was destroyed, and all its residents murdered. Luckily for Ota Benga, he was out hunting at the time, but on returning to the burning ruins, he found that his wife and children had been killed. Then, when things could not get any worse, he was captured by slavers. This chance encounter and Benga's unusual sharpened teeth convinced Werner to purchase him, trading the young man for a pound of salt and a bundle of cloth. Then, after gathering another 4 pygmies, he took them to North America. When the pygmies were put on display in St. Louis, all kinds of rumors surrounded their presence. It was said they were an entirely different species of human, like mini Neanderthal. Some even claimed they were the missing link between us and our non-human ancestors. Ota Benga was the subject of very specific rumors, that he was a real cannibal, and that his teeth were sharpened to bite through human bone. Such a brutal rumor for such a small man made him a sensation. But it was all ultimately for nothing, as after the World's Fair was over, Benga had no direction. He remarried, but his second wife also soon died, because some people just have good luck. Now alone in America with no money, he grew ever more reliant on Werner. But Werner was unreliable at best, and effectively gave Benga away to a zoo in New York. Ota Benga was taken to the Bronx Zoo in 1906, where at first he was just a regular employee. It was assumed that because Benga was African, he would have a natural ability to handle animals from Africa, but it turns out the lions just wanted to eat him. So when that plan failed, they decided to just put him in a cage. Exhibiting Benga in the monkey house each afternoon, massive crowds were drawn, as was media attention. From day one, local newspapers debated if it was okay to keep a man in a zoo, with some viewing him as a slave, and others saying he was just a cool guy who lived in a cage. In the meantime, massive crowds mobbed Ota Benga whenever he left the enclosure. When the crowds grew too bold, he responded in kind, at one point firing his bow and arrow at them. But as much as he hated the crowds, he hated being locked up more, fighting zookeepers when they tried to force him back into the enclosure, which is fair enough. Word got out that he was being held against his will, and later that year the mayor of New York ordered his release. I think the mayor was more confused by the situation than anything.
Okay, so I think it's, you could, we're running a little bit behind, I think, but you get the idea as to how it was. And the St. Louis Word Fair was the big part, so there were like people, who were founders of behaviorism, Boas, Woodrow Wilson, even Ernest Rutherford, the physicist from UK, was visiting. So there was a big meeting on the so-called development of man. And there was thrust to find the so-called missing link, okay? But the whole light, and they were shown, they even had carried out a sort of mini Olympic of non-white people and trying to show the triumph of the Western man. So that was one of the big thing at St. Louis. Okay, so I think, we have moved right along, so I'm not sure which slide number that is, but we should stop here probably and continue next time. And thank you all for sticking around. And I think it's we ran few minutes, but hopefully we can stop the recording and we'll pick up where we left off. And so hopefully most of you got at least something out of it, at least,